Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. Today we are continuing our series into different genres of fantasy that you might want to include or even build your campaigns around. Today we're talking about heroic fantasy. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
All right, everybody, welcome back. John and I are continuing today in our series talking about different genres that you'll include within your gaming sessions. Today we're going to be talking about heroic fantasy. This is probably one that most of you are familiar with, but we want to show how this, contrasts to some of the other genres we've talked about and how to specifically build your campaign around this heroic concept. So, John, why don't you get us started by giving some definition as to what is heroic fantasy? How should we think about this when we're building a world or a campaign around it?
Well, I mean, to be the easy way is we just got done doing the anti-heroic fantasy style. So this is anti-heroic fantasy. It is everything that anti-heroic fantasy is not. It's about, good heroes doing good things in a good world. Generally speaking, the lines are clearly drawn between what is right, what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. There's not really much of a question here. Every hero in the story is Captain America or Wonder Woman or something like that. Like, they are peak hero, and it's like, if you want the problem to be solved, you get a hero. You don't go for your run-of-the-mill type people. They're the only ones for the job, and that's basically the core of what this style of fantasy is.
Yeah, it's almost like you have that quest board out there asking for heroes to come and clearly take out the bandit that's in his camp away from the major town, or to go rescue a daughter, or to go defeat the bad guy that's X, Y, and Z on the map. Like, it's very much we're making a call out to heroes, men or women who know that they are beyond the standard of what the average peasant is, and they're going to go out there and do the good deed. And there's no moral quandary.
Right.
Like, that this is good and this is bad, and characters aren't having to sit there and go, is this really the right thing to do? Should I really be engaging in this act? Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Right. We had talked a little bit in the previous video about how you walk into a town and there's somebody for sale, like they're selling a person. And we had talked about how it's like that's status quo, that's normal in the anti-heroic world. In the heroic world, it's like that is the cue to a quest that needs to be solved by a hero, and no one is going to fault the hero for going in and busting down the door to kill the evil slavers, because that's what's right. And the reason that slavery exists is because there's somebody evil in charge, and that person needs to be dispatched, probably because they didn't belong in charge. They're a tyrant or something, and the rightful ruler of that realm needs to be restored. Like, all of that is just rote. It is expected in this type of environment that everything that you're doing as a character in this world is right, and there's never a question if you come across an injustice that you right it, and everybody is just okay with that, because it's the way that everything should be.
Yeah, your characters are going to be aligning their actions with what is good and moral, and there's going to be no question about it. Like, that's going to make them heroes in the town. They're going to receive renown. They're going to be rewarded by going against it. And if for some reason you have a town that is evil in nature, then that means that if the characters overthrow that government and set somebody in there, the whole region is going to be exalted and throw parties and celebrations in their name for doing this deed for them.
Right.
I think the real challenge here, and this may need to come later in the video, but the real challenge here is that you as the DM need to make sure that your own morality is set in place, and that you're because really, I think the challenge here is that you're building a campaign that is reflective of what the current morality is of the real world. I know we've used this example of slavery, which seems kind of odd that we're sitting here talking about that, but we know slavery is wrong. That is something that we recognize in today's world, and we recognize it as being moral to fight against slavery. Several hundred years ago, that would not have been the case necessarily if you were running a D&D campaign. So you kind of have to be on board in terms of what is acceptable as being a moral standard and insert those into the games, and not necessarily gray area concepts that society outside of gameplay is still arguing about.
Right. And of course that's dependent on your table and everything else. So I don't want to get too far into like moral quandaries of today. But yeah, definitely there, like you said, there are no gray areas. There are no moral quandaries. If the heroes are going into a, to kill some orcs, the orc tribe they go to kill are all orc warriors. All of them are evil. There are no women and children. There are no elderly. Everybody in that camp should die because they're all evil, and there's never a situation where they walk in and they see a mother breastfeeding a child and they have to decide whether or not they want to kill the mother and the child. Like, that's just not a question that will come up in this type of fantasy setting because it's not appropriate to the genre.
And I think the other thing in how heroic fantasy differs from anti-heroic fantasy especially is that every problem can be solved with a quest,
right?
In the way that you present it. You're just not going to have these things that are going to lead to, I mean, you may have quests that lead to more problems and more issues, but another quest will always solve the problem. And it doesn't mean that they're not complex problems. It's just there will always be a continuous quest line that allows you to overcome that and set the world right again.
Right. It becomes kind of like an Ouroboros. It feeds itself after a while. And usually this type of situation is like you're going through and you've eliminated the bandit in the region, but the bandit was funded by somebody else, and then you follow that quest line. And it's not that what you are doing as a hero in this world is creating more problems that you then have to resolve, which would be the case in a lot of dark fantasy settings or grimdark fantasy settings. It is that you are continuing to chase down the head of the snake in order to eventually eliminate it. And that is the only way that you are able to finally defeat this great evil. The scale of this, which we'll talk about a little bit when we get into epic fantasy, but the scale of this can vary a lot. The main thing is, like we talked about earlier, is that it has to be a hero. The hero is the person who can solve this problem, whether that is something that's a local problem or a world problem, it doesn't matter. That's what heroic fantasy is.
Yeah, and you may see your characters as you move them through stages of becoming heroes. I mean, of course, all tabletop role-playing games start oftentimes with your character being a low-level, first-level person that's building up to a place of being recognized as a hero. But the concept here is that heroics always lives inside of the character.
Right.
So the player is always playing a hero. It's just their recognition of being a hero is slowly evolving as they move through the course of gameplay.
Right, and we had talked about this a little bit before. I liken a lot to Captain America. And I'm not super familiar with the comics, but in terms of the first movie, he is always a hero. He just doesn't have the physical prowess at the start of the movie in order to be able to accomplish that. And once he gets that, he doesn't change in terms of the type of person he is. He maintains that heroism. When he has questions that come across to him in terms of like what he might consider or what we as the watchers might consider to be gray areas, he almost always has a moral compass that points north. He always does what is right. There's no question about it. He knows what's good and he does it. And that, again, is kind of the core of what we're talking about with this type of setting. But it's important to recognize that there usually is some kind of sense of humble beginnings for characters. They have this origin story that is usually rooted in having the heroic sensibilities, but not necessarily having the prowess or the ability associated with that. And training montage, then they can do it.
Yeah. There's so many pieces of literature I think we can fall back on. I mean, and maybe this doesn't exactly fit, but I think of Harry Potter, that's heroic fantasy in many ways. It's Harry coming up to be the hero. If you look at Lord of the Rings, it has a lot of similar aspects of heroic fantasy. Samwise, for instance, for me, is like the hero in that he is always the hero. He always does the right thing or tries to do the right thing. And I think that a lot of players fall back on tropes in the fantasy genre and thinking of heroic fantasy when they're first coming into playing D&D. So this is, in my opinion, oftentimes one of the first types of sessions you're running, especially with new players.
Yeah, and I do want to point out, because we've been providing examples kind of throughout the series where we talk about Lord of the Rings or any of these other works of fiction and we assign aspects of these genres to those works. And it's important to remember that when you're talking about genres in fantasy, there's a lot of mixing and matching going on.
Oh, yeah.
There are very few, and I hesitate to think of any that are purely one type of fantasy. So something like Lord of the Rings has heroic elements. It also has dark elements. It has epic elements. It has low magic elements. There's a ton of stuff going on when you talk about what the type of genre that a specific work of fiction fits into. And we're trying to provide some kind of the categories, and then you can pull from various ones in order to create your own world eventually.
I appreciate you saying that. I was thinking that in the back of my mind just as I was giving examples, being like, but they fit lots of other genres.
They do,
too.
And most of them do, and that's it is what it is. You know, nothing is purely one thing or the other.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know that I have anything else to add around heroic fantasy. I think for a lot of individuals, we kind of have this set idea. We have a lot of examples, again, that are out there in the world to kind of fall back on when we're building heroic fantasy. For me, the two big pieces are your characters are always a hero. It takes a hero to win the day, and problems can be solved with quests.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead and finish.
No, I was just saying that's where I fall back on. When I think of heroic fantasy, I think of that. My characters are always heroes, and they can always fall back on quests to solve the problem of the day.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I'm thinking of is that a lot of this is character-centric, because we're talking about heroic in the same way that anti-heroic. Heroes are always good, but they're also always strong. They're always beautiful. They're always kind of that idealized version of what we consider to be humanity. They are the best of the best, which is part of what it means. Villains are the reverse of that. They're always evil. They're always ugly. They're always in some way deformed. This is a trope that you can see throughout human history, especially when you get into mythologies in, Greek mythology and other ones dating backwards, is that evil is misshapen and ugly. Good is beautiful and strong, and that is something that you really want to key in on when you're creating the world, when you're creating quests, when you're creating encounters. The villain is not a mystery. The villain is only a mystery until they're found. I'll say that. So as soon as they find the head of the snake or the next stage up, it's always very clear that the villain is villainous. You don't go into a situation where it's like, that's the evil person, and you kill them only to find out later on that they were actually, good. That's not going to happen in this style of fantasy, because it's should be very evident to the players. There should be, again, no moral quandaries in this style.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. We hope that you enjoyed this video. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you all next time.
Jon and Josh.